Welcome back to another video on my channel, and the new Leica M11 is just in the market for about 10 weeks, give or take, and as expected, Leica already brought just these days new firmware for this beautiful rangefinder camera. Clearly I installed it already. I will look into it in this video and walk you through. Let's get started. After my bad experience when I installed the former firmware, where my camera almost got bricked, and you find all the details in this video here, where I warned people, I decided this time to do the update via the Leica Fotos app, which actually worked like a charm. If you connected your Leica M11 before to your iPhone, which you see here in a screen recording on display, then automatically you will get a message saying that there is an update available. If you then push that soft button on the right hand side, you get into a screen where Leica is informing you about improvements, new features and anything you can expect to come to your camera with the new firmware. The information we get here is that we are talking about version 1.3.0.0. That perspective control, which already was on the Leica M10R and the M10 Mono and so on, via firmware update some time back, is now also in the firmware of the Leica M11, and that was a big surprise to me some time back that they just canceled it out, but very likely the firmware was not fully mature. Then we get additional exposure metering by highlight weighted metering, and we get additional storage options. I come to that, will explain it, show it, and we also get some bug fixes, which is always an interesting bullet if manufacturers update firmware. If you then push the button for update, the camera gets connected, in my case here via Wi-Fi, to the iPhone, and then the update process starts and you can safely lean back and wait until everything is done. The firmware gets transferred to the camera from the phone, and when is it transferred to the camera, you also see some progress bar here. Then the camera will start the update process. Don't switch it off, just let the camera get the job done, and when everything is done you will recognize it because the camera will switch back into live view. Let's quickly check that the new firmware is correctly installed. So let's go into the menu here. And let's see, we have here camera informations, and on camera informations we have now firmware 1.3.00, which is exactly what we wanted. The first new feature concerns light metering. So in order to see that this has correctly been installed, let's go here to the status screen, and then we have here, if we look here, we have spot metering, we have center weighted, that's been there before. What's also been there before is multi-field, but new is highlight weighted. And that will meter the whole scene and then take highlights into account, expose them correctly, which typically ends up in a situation where you expose to the left or underexposed other parts of the scene. But since the dynamic range of the sensor is very high on the Leica M11, you can then easily recover information in shadows in post, and at least your highlights are correctly metered and correctly replicated into the image. The effect of highlight weighted metering can easily be demonstrated here. So let me try to do this. Let me go here into multi-field metering. Let me take a shot here towards my LED lighting at the wall. First shot. Now let's change the metering. Let's go to highlight weighted and you will see the difference immediately. So here we go. Now let's go into play here, and this is the image with multi-field metering, and this is the image where I weighted the highlights with that new metering method, which is now available with the new firmware, and you see the difference. And what this does here, highlight weighted metering, means it exposes the colors in the lights much better than on this image where the LEDs are overblown. If you look at that, here it is much better. This is really taking into account and optimizing towards the highlights, whereas here it is a compromise, and here then I have most parts of the image exposed to the left, but I can correct this easily in post based on the excellent dynamic range of the Leica M11. And it is always much easier to recover in post information out of shadows than recovering information from overblown highlights, in particular if there is clipping coming in, and also the coloring will not be right if you have too much overblown exposure and try to recover later in post. So exposure to the left is always superior if you want to go for that, and highlight weighted metering clearly is a feature I super embrace, and I'm very happy that Leica brought it like they brought it before on other Leica cameras. The next feature, and that's something we got in a firmware update some time back on the Leica M10R, the Leica M10 monochrome and so on, is perspective correction. And here it is a direct menu entry. So if you go on page number 3, you find perspective correction. So let's take it on and let's see what happens. And now I get here correction lines, and actually my scene gets cropped in a way that I have no falling lines. So let's take a shot here. First of all, let's change the metering. Now I don't want the highlight weighted metering. Let's go here to multi-field. Let's take a couple of shots and let's see how they get corrected here automatically by perspective control. So that's the first one. Typically, if you point your camera towards a tall building, you get these falling lines. You can basically optically correct them only by a shift lens. And what happens here, of course, is a digital correction with a crop. And since we have here 60 megapixel, if we go to the largest resolution, we have plenty of space to crop in. That doesn't really harm and doesn't take away too much headroom on resolution. So let's take the shot here. And you see the fallen lines are corrected. Here my LED is straight up lined, looks very good. Let's take another one, a very awkward one. Let's go for this one. You see already how it is correcting here. Let's take that shot. Already corrected. But that is a feature we had on the M10R, on the M10 Mono. I liked it a lot. I was disappointed with the first firmware that it was not there, but I guessed, and clearly I was right here, that with the next firmware version we'll get it back also on the M11. And here we go. Perspective correction is now on and you can choose it in the menu. The next feature which we saw on the list of new functions is actually in the storage section. So let's go here to storage options. And now we have here all these choices. Most of them we had before, but what is new is that we can now choose DNG, so the raw file, on the SD card to be stored and the JPEG on the internal memory. And that is actually a smart feature because most professional photographers will only work with DNG files in post and they use the JPEG only for a quick preview. So it is absolutely fine to leave the JPEG in the internal memory, don't even transfer it to the SD card, and then also not having to sort it out on the computer. Just take the DNG files, upload them to Lightroom or Photoshop, develop them, and don't pay any attention any longer to the JPEGs. And if your raw files have been successfully developed, you clean up the internal memory on the camera and then you're good to go and have freed up the space. For me, nevertheless, I typically choose this setting here, DNG and JPEG on internal memory and the SD card, because my greatest fear is that I took the photo of my life and the SD card has a breakdown. And then I know I have a backup copy in the internal memory and that is still my preferred choice. The last item on the list of improvements in the new firmware 1.3.0.0 talks about bug fixes. And clearly very successful companies like Apple and Leica, by definition, they never make mistakes. But there are typically bugs in iPhones as well as in Leica cameras. And one of these bugs, in my opinion, was when you did the previous firmware updates, you had to remove the SD card, which is absolutely unnecessary. And I did it wrong. I posted a video about it and I actually almost bricked my camera. This seems to be fixed and I'm sure there are plenty of other bug fixes which Leica has provided in the new firmware. So I recommend really to install it and play around with it. What I will also test in the next days is whether we see now an improvement on pixel binning. So if we go here to the lower resolutions, let's just quickly go there. So if we have here DNG resolution, we have these three options, the full native resolution, 60 megapixel, the 36 and the 18. And so far, although Leica spoke about pixel binning, which sounds like very fancy computational photography, I didn't really see any improvements on the lower resolution files when it comes to noise or dynamic range. I'll test this out again and I would not be astonished or surprised if the new firmware also here made improvements. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel, there's always more to come. Thanks for watching, of course, and peace out.